Welcome to this next session of Data Summit Connect on succeeding with database management in the cloud era. So I'm Mary D. Ojala. I am the conference program director for Information Today, Inc. And in this session, we have two spectacular speakers. We will start off with Craig Mullins. Craig runs his own consulting business, Mullins Consulting, and he is a columnist for Database Trends and Applications. He's also an IBM Gold consultant. So Craig will talk to us about, succeeding, and where are we? Changing requirement for database integration. Got too many notes here. And following Craig will be John Pocknell, who is Senior Marketing Strategist, Database Solutions, Quest Software. And John's topic will fit right in there, tools for a cross-platform DBA. So the other little housekeeping thing is to thank Sumo Logic, who is our diamond sponsor for Data Summit Connect. And now let me turn the session over to Craig Mullins. Craig, you want to go ahead, share your screen, and unmute.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Mary D. And happy to be here today to talk to everybody about the changing requirements of database administration. This is kind of a scaled down version of a longer presentation that I've adapted to hopefully fit into the 30 minutes that I've got available to speak with you today. So, quickly, I'll be talking about the changing role of the DBA as the job adapts to the changing industry and technological trends. And we'll take a look at things like the current database landscape, as well as trends including cloud, DevOps, data growth, the Internet of Things, and a lot more along the way. So let's dig right in and start with the current database landscape. And here I'll look at the role of the DBA at a high level, as well as the current market situation with database management systems. So I want to start by defining what a database administrator is. A lot of you probably are DBAs, know what that is, but it can't hurt to start at the beginning. So a DBA is an information technician that's responsible for ensuring the ongoing operational functionality and efficiency of the organization's databases, as well as the applications that access those databases. So I like to talk about DBA as a management discipline, and it's a discipline that's evolved to plan, model, implement and manage database systems. And it really comprises all the things that I'm showing you here on the screen, as well as probably more. I'm not going to read this to you. Just a way of saying there's an awful lot that goes into managing database systems. And another way you can say it is that a good DBA is a jack of all trades and a master of some trades. But all too often organizations are kind of clueless about all these things that DBAs are required to do. Now that we've defined what a DBA is, let's take a look at the current landscape for database management systems. And I think at the top of the list really is that the world's no longer only relational or only SQL SQL. We've got NoSQL database systems, and they're being deployed to support specific use cases, specific types of workloads. And this has given rise to this term polyglot persistence. And it's a big multi-syllable word, and it really just means that we use the right database platform for each specific requirement, instead of trying to force fit everything into a single DBMS. And that was usually a relational DBMS, like we're an Oracle shop or we're a DB2 shop. Okay, so I'm not really going to try to explain the use cases for each of the NoSQL database types, but there's 4 of them. There's document, graph, key value, and wide column store. And each of them has specific benefits, pros and cons for why and when you adopt them. And another trend is that we're seeing database systems that are hybrid, and they combine multiple models into a single DBMS. So it could be document and key value, it could be graph and relational. And we're seeing that grow as a type of DBMS. Anyway, though, each type of database platform has its own pros and cons, and DBAs need to understand the use cases for each so that they can guide their organization to choose appropriately. You know, this is different than the prevailing relational only mindset of just a few years ago, where every new project used one of the major DBMS systems. You know, also, I got to say that, you know, even without these new types of database systems, most organizations use more than one relational DBMS, you know, even before NoSQL came on the scene. So you had Oracle and DB2, SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, Informix, you know, and so on. And on top of that, there's still organizations, usually larger organizations that run mainframe systems that use pre-relational databases, things like IMS or IDMS. Then there's this additional trend that Gartner refers to as hybrid transactional analytical processing. And really what this means is that we're using a single DBMS to deliver both transaction processing and analytics workloads. And a lot of times organizations split that out. So you'd run your transactional workload on Oracle or DB2, and you'd run your analytical workload on some kind of warehouse appliance. And increasingly, they're being brought together under a single model with hybrid transactional analytical processing. And you know, another clear trend is, you know, more work's being done in memory with things like SAP HANA. And then don't forget about Hadoop and Spark, and they're used for long-term data persistence needs when the schema may not be known up front, or the schema needs to be flexible for things like, you know, data lakes. So the bottom line here is that organizations on average have between 100 and 500 database instances, and those run across multiple platforms and multiple products. And really the net of that all is that things are getting more and more heterogeneous, and at the same time, more complex. So from a heterogeneity perspective, here we see a chart of the most popular DBMS products as ranked by a site called DB Engines. Got the URL here down at the bottom of the screen. DB Engines, you know, tracks over 350 different database systems, and this capture was as of March of this year. Shows the top 25 or so of the most popular DBMSs. And, you know, they span the gamut from relational to NoSQL to multi-value and more. And, you know, it's a good resource, DB Engines, so you can kind of keep track of all the different types of DBMSs. But really, this slide is to drive home the point that there are a lot of options to choose from and a lot of different things that DBAs need to understand. Okay, so now that we've level set where things are database-wise, but we really haven't even scraped the surface of the trends that are impacting DBAs these days. So, you know, take a quick look at this slide. It, you know, lists out the trends, and we're going to be looking at, you know, each of these at least at a high level as we move through the presentation. So I'm not going to read this slide to you. Anyway, before moving along to start looking at each of those trends, I just wanted to show this chart of the top technology trends impacting DBAs. It comes from a study done by Unisphere Research, and it was published earlier this year in January. And really the issues here are similar to those on the previous slide that I just showed you, and things like cloud and big data and AI and DevOps and Agile and NoSQL. So let's dig into it. And I'll start by talking about big data and data growth as a trend. We'll kind of look at the pace of data growth, and the lack of skilled data professionals to manage this deluge of data. And don't worry, I'm not going to go into what is big data and go through the V's. You've all heard that to death. From a data growth perspective, go to IDC. They have their global Datasphere study. And as you might expect, it shows unabated growth over the next few years through the year 2025. We're storing more and more data every year, and that trend is really not going to change anytime soon. All the way up to in 2025, they predict the global datasphere to be 175 zettabytes. I don't know which analyst is out there counting all this data, but I'm always skeptical of hard and fast numbers like this. But I think the trend is accurate. So the amount of data that our organizations are accumulating is growing at an alarming rate. But I think what's more troubling is the lack of attention this receives from management. Lack of attention, at least in terms of what matters, and that's staffing. Yeah, most organizations and their leaders and executives are saying things like, we want to take advantage of analytics on big data, and we treat data as a corporate asset. But the actual reality is somewhat of a neglect, and it's shown by this stat from computer economics. Data management staff, as a percentage of IT, has risen less than 1% over this 4-year period that they tracked. And at the same time, from the same study, IT spending per user is also declining. Now, these trends kind of align with what I think is the #1 overall IT management challenge, and that's lack of budget. So companies are collecting more data and connecting more applications than they ever have before. And they say they want to make sure that that data is secure and reliable and accessible. And in other words, they're saying we need DBAs. But despite these increased demands, companies aren't growing their DBA staff. If you look at the data on this slide, it comes from a DBA staffing's ratio report. And it shows that DBAs have dropped to 2.8% of the total IT staff, down from 3% in 2016, 3.3% in 2014. This poses a significant risk. More data with industry trends like the explosion of mobile devices and the growth of the Internet of Things means that more and more data is going to continue to be accumulated and amassed. And that means that we need more DBAs to oversee the data. But DBAs are making up a declining percentage of the total IT staff. Maybe we see management putting too much faith in things like marketing saying this is a no outage database, or maybe the expected growth in DBA outsourcing, or self-managing databases. And all those things are happening and lend some credence to this. And also the more tooling that helps you to manage database systems in the cloud with software as a service. And we'll look at that coming up in a minute. But still, decreasing DBAs with increasing data is a recipe for problems. Another stat backing this up comes from Quinn Street Enterprise Research, and it shows that things aren't going to improve anytime soon. Now, I like this particular graphic, not because of the specific numbers, 50 times and 1.5 times, which may or may not be 100% accurate, but the trend is accurate. Organizations are increasing the amount of data they store and manage, but they're not increasing their staffing at anywhere near the same rate. So this mismatch that DBAs need to deal with is a concern and a reality. Next trend. We'll turn our attention to the cloud. And the cloud probably is the biggest overarching trend out there in the computing world today. And the general idea is you're using a network of remote servers and it's hosted on the internet rather than on a local server or personal computer. But really, pure cloud computing is not the future, at least for large enterprise computing. Hybrid multi-cloud adoption is the way of the future. Hybrid meaning both on-premises and in the cloud, multi-cloud meaning multiple clouds, both private and public. Here we see some research from a 2019 study done by analysts at 451 Research. We see that almost 2/3 of organizations are currently pursuing a hybrid IT strategy, with 57% adopting an integrated hybrid cloud approach, and a further 8% planning to use both on and off premises resources, but really not in a unified way. So cloud usage and adoption is increasing, but don't let anybody tell you that everything will move to the cloud. The future is hybrid with both on premises and off premises, and preferably in an integrated fashion as you do that. Now, at the same time, looking at that Unisphere study again, we see that cloud is becoming more commonplace. More than half of the DBAs they surveyed earlier in the year say they're actively managing at least some data in the cloud. But that same report says that enterprise cloud is immature and most data is still managed and stored on premises, as well as a problem. Most DBAs have relatively little experience with cloud management. So as you move to the cloud, there are a lot of considerations you need to keep in mind. Things that change, an increased involvement in cost control and budgeting and things of that nature. If the DBAs aren't involved with that, you quickly find yourself possibly consuming more services, more resources than you planned, and that causes a big spike in billing. Another concern is security. You gotta make sure things are secure when you move to the cloud. And we'll talk about security a little bit as we move forward. And also keep in mind that moving to the cloud doesn't eliminate things like performance management as a DBA requirement. Also, bleeding edge. When you move to the cloud and you let the cloud database provider provide the cloud database for you, you're bleeding edge. They don't support back level versions of the DBMS. It's going to be the current version of release. Yeah, you can put your own instance up in the cloud with some cloud practices, and really that drives home the point. The cloud is much more than just the cloud. It's lots of different types of cloud implementations. But if you're using a cloud database in the cloud, they're moving forward. You have to move with them at that same rate of change. And that can cause issues because there are a lot of things that impact your applications and your deployments. Backup and recovery is still an issue. Some people wrongly assume that the cloud provider takes care of all the backups and recovery. But it might be true for some bare bones nightly or weekly recovery, but you still need to make sure that your backup plans are adequate for your organization's recovery time objectives. And finally, you need to make sure that the tools you have are also cloud enabled and can deliver the services supporting the cloud databases that your organization's using. And talking about security, that brings us to data breaches. They're still one of the biggest concerns out there, and they're still occurring quite frequently. Here we see some data from the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse. They started tracking data breaches back in 2005, and since then, as of May of this year, there have been over 10.5 billion total records of sensitive data that's been breached. That's an average of 12 data breaches a week. So it's a lot of breaches happening, and it's costly. An average cost of a data breach is over $7 million. A lot of factors that weigh into that, like fines and legal judgments and legal defense and notification costs and supplying credit monitoring to any impacted customers, the cost of tools and forensic analysis, and even the impact to the reputation of your company. So can add up to a substantial amount. What if you look further though? What's the cost per record breached? That can be a difficult thing to come up with, but a recent study by Pocknell suggests that the average cost is $141 per record. But that's just an average, and it can change based on the amount of data that's co-opted and the type of data. So the number doesn't really apply to all breaches, but it's a good cookie cutter average to keep in mind. And old problems still linger on, things like SQL injection. If you look at this trend here, you can see that the percentage of attacks have stayed roughly the same over almost a decade here, between 28% and 32% over the years tracked. So, this is a known vulnerability and it's been there for a long time. And, we haven't, fixed it, at least as it shows here. If you really want to learn more about SQL injection, here's a link to an article I wrote on it, which has some more details. But let's move forward to regulatory compliance, and that's the process of understanding and complying with laws, policies, and regulations that dictate what we have to do with data in terms of storage and protection, the controls that we need to put in place for them. So what's driving this? Why are there more and more regulations that are being created and imposed? Well, look at what we've already discussed. Data breaches continue unabated. Data growth continues. And that more data that's there, it still needs to be protected. And there's regulations out there that require organizations to retain data for longer periods of time. So not only is there more and more data, we have to retain more and more of it from a regulatory perspective. That all needs to be managed. And then the SQL injection, there are things that we know about, we just aren't remediating. So regulation is needed kind of to force organizations to do the right thing. So what's the impact of all this? Security and data breaches and regulatory compliance. Well, it requires more work. The first thing to think about is database security, which rises in importance in terms of the things that you're doing. There's more new security related features being added to database systems all the time. Things like improved auditing and encryption and data masking, and trusted context and roles, and improved separation of duties for access control to the database. And then there's the right to be forgotten. That's a mandate of GDPR, the European Data Protection Rule, and it impacts any EU citizen. If you think about right to be forgotten, do you have the ability to find every piece of data that relates to an individual who says, I want to be forgotten? That's not a simple task, considering all the places that data could be stored, not just in the database, but even just in the database, it can be a non-trivial task. And let's not forget about metadata. That's critical in a regulated world. If you want to be able to use your data, you have to make sure that you have the data documented beyond simple things like data type and length, but which data applies to which regulation. Products like a data catalog can help you with this. And if you don't have the accurate metadata and the ability to identify and define what data you have, including where it came from and who uses it, how can you ever hope to be in compliance with governmental regulations? And some or all of these things on this slide become aspects of the DBA's job as the DBA morphs into the modern era. Next up, let's take a quick look at AI and machine learning. If we look, adoption of AI is rapidly increasing, and organizations are experiencing returns on their investment, as shown here. This data comes from McKinsey & Company, and it shows a 25% year-over-year increase in the use of AI from 2018 to 2019. And that same study shows that AI adoption is providing higher revenue for business areas that adopt it. And 44% are saying not only is it higher revenue, but also cost reduction. 58% of organizations have embedded at least one AI capability into a process or a product in at least one of their business units. And that's up from 47% in 2018. So what we see is AI adoption is, in general, becoming more and more mainstream. So what does that mean for DBAs? AI requires data to be successful. AI works by combining large amounts of data with fast processing and intelligent algorithms and things like machine learning that allows the software to learn automatically from patterns or features in your data. So AI systems have this ability to process enormous amounts of data. They become more accurate the more data that they can ingest. And the demand for that data is going to continue to grow as AI adoption expands. So what's the impact on DBAs? Well, there's going to be more management required because there's more data being used for AI and machine learning. So we see organizations that are adopting AI and ML for business purposes, but AI won't just impact business apps. DBAs will be able to benefit from more tasks being automated with AI and machine learning. For example, there are tools out there that use machine learning to apply AI to improve access path selection by understanding your data and your organization's access patterns. These features can improve SQL optimization by a tech. They look for and see access path regression for both dynamic and static SQL statements and give you the ability to find them and correct them before they start impacting performance in a negative way. Additionally, we see AI being applied to assess system parameters and settings of your DBMS. So they use machine learning to detect exceptions from operational performance and then suggest improvements to these settings, or as you trust it, apply it right away. Finally, DBAs are also going to be supporting data scientists and other experts that access data for AI and machine learning. So there's more constituents that you need to support. The next topic is heterogeneity, and I want to go through that quickly because we've touched on that already. But for a long time, the top 5 DBMSs were really dominating the market. They controlled over 90% of the revenue through 2011. That number starts to dip in 2016, but it's still significant. And this is largely driven by NoSQL making some inroads into the market, but the DBMS market is still dominated by SQL and relational. But it is more heterogeneous than ever before. So DBAs are expected to be able to administer multiple DBMS products, and that makes life more difficult because it means things are more complex. You need to be able to decide which DBMS to use, how to manage the usage of each engine in a multi-model DBMS. Remember, I talked about hybrid. So knowing, say, DB2 and Cassandra and Mongo and Oracle, and also how to use each of the engines within those that are multi-DBMS. Finally, the industry is going to consolidate. Things can't have the 300 or so products out there, vying for your attention. Over time, in any industry, the top 3 companies claim as much as 70 to 90% of the market. And that's according to a study done by Harvard Business Review. So the DBAs need to make sure they understand what products they're using and have an identified path to how they move forward as the things consolidate. Another impact is DevOps. Usually we see DevOps, shown with this infinity symbol like we see here. Really, what that's talking about is continuous development, continuous integration, and continuous delivery, where we see dev and ops operating on teams, automating the software delivery process. And that means more software improvements delivered in smaller chunks more frequently instead of waiting till the end of the project. But it means also that DBAs have to adapt. If we look at this slide, we see that app teams are accustomed to releasing code more rapidly than ops teams, more rapidly than the infrastructure teams. And the DBAs are in the ops world. This chart comes from Forrester Research, and it shows that releases being quarterly or faster, the apps teams are used to that. Releases slower, that's where the infrastructure teams are accustomed to operating. So we need to have some way of these teams coming together at a rate that's similar for both. In order to do this, DBAs need to adapt. They need to participate in the software development lifecycle from the very start and speed things up in terms of how they work. In order to do that, it requires tooling. It requires integrated tooling. And a lot of that's been done with the development DevOps pipeline, but it's only now just really happening with the DBA pipeline. And that's things like performance management and database change management and backup and recovery and reorganization and statistics accumulation and performance of SQL. All those things need to be integrated into this pipeline and automated intelligently. It isn't just throwing the DDL in GitHub like a lot of people think DBA DevOps is. Quickly now, the IoT. The Internet of Things. There's this new rule out there that anything that can be connected will be connected, and the benefit can be tremendous. And it's not the future, it's already huge. There's more sensors existing on the planet today than there are people, and the sensors are generating data, and that data, some of it is being stored and needs to be managed. This slide, I think, brings it all home in terms of why DBAs can't simply ignore the Internet of Things. This is my favorite IoT story from a DBA perspective. It seems absurd on the surface, but a casino hooked up a thermometer to the aquarium in its lobby. It hooked it up to the IoT. It makes sense, right? You don't want to climb up onto the fish tank every time you need to adjust the thermometer. But you have to be diligent with your security because hackers accessed that entry into the network through the Internet of Things in that thermometer and access the casino's high roller database. And they were able to have a data breach right through that thermometer. So you have to be aware of the IoT, how it's being used and how it's being secured. So the overall bottom line here is that DBAs are being asked to do more with larger amounts and more types of data being accessed more rapidly and from more sources, without any prolonged downtime permitted, using and supporting new database types and capabilities, and with fewer DBAs as a percentage of IT staff than ever before. So it's a challenge. So what can we do? We need to treat DBA as a management discipline, as I noted at the beginning. Understand what that management discipline is, what it entails, and enact the right processes and controls in an automated manner to help it succeed. Automate as much as you can, turn tasks over to the computer, integrate and orchestrate DBA tasks into the DevOps toolchain, take advantage of AI and machine learning whenever and however possible, and embrace modern DBA tools and utilities that understand this new digital landscape, including hybrid multi-cloud, including DevOps, including NoSQL and relational. And finally, don't ignore training. Always be learning. Be aware of what's new in the industry and at your shop. Dig in and learn everything you can. And that's my session. Feel free to reach out and contact me about anything I talked about here, or really any of your data management challenges at all. So at this point, I'll turn it over.
You'll turn it back over to me, Craig.
Yes, I will. Mary D.
Hey, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love your closing comment there about always be learning, because that's kind of why we're all here. So that's super. So let me now turn it over to John Pocknell from Quest Software. And let me also remind the audience that if you have questions for either Craig or John, I've already got about 3 questions for Craig. Now let me turn it over to John. Put your questions into the question box. Tools for a cross-platform DBA. John, go ahead.
Thank you, Mary D. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much, Craig, as well for the prior session. And we were saying earlier on actually that Craig's sessions provides us a perfect segue into this, because what Craig's been talking about is what we talk about on a regular basis here at Quest. And actually my role is to do just that. It's provide thought leadership and address these challenges that companies have in their operations teams to try and solve some of these challenges. So let's give me some insights into kind of what we're seeing as well, because it really forms our product strategy here in Quest as we move forward. And so there's kind of 4 key areas that we hear about, which touch on a lot of what Craig's just been talking about. Number 1 is the diversity of data that we're seeing across the enterprise. And this is another survey from PASS. Actually, 69% of companies are managing between 2 and 5 different platform types, including NoSQL. And this presents a challenge from the perspective of the DBA because it's increased complexity. It's very hard to maintain operational control and also extract value from data to gain business insights. Another key area that Craig talked about was cloud. A lot of companies have a cloud-first strategy, and I completely agree with Craig that, you know, what we're seeing actually is more hybrid. I don't think we're going to see companies 100% move to cloud anytime soon. However, moving databases to the cloud, workloads to the cloud, we're hearing that, as confirmed by this report as well, Flexera State of the Cloud report, that organizations are over budget by up to 23%. On average, about 30% of cloud spend is being wasted. And there are a number of reasons for that. Number one is they find it hard to actually right-size the service tier that they need to be on. And two is they can't adequately manage database performance in the cloud. It's a new area for a lot of DBAs who may be used to managing database performance in their data center, and cloud's a whole different experience in terms of workload performance. Database workloads run differently in the cloud than they do on-prem, and it's important for DBAs to understand those differences. The other one that Craig talked about as well was DevOps, business agility. And this is high on the radar for a lot of CIOs. 38% of CIOs in this survey said that the speed of delivery of database changes was actually their top driver, database DevOps. But the reality is, you know, database integration into the DevOps methodology is taking a long time to happen. Why? Because it's data. You're making changes to the data and the data structures, and that makes DBAs very, very nervous. And he had a lot of pushback from DBAs to adopt DevOps and CICD practices on the database level. But the reality is the business is driving this, and ultimately businesses want convergence in IT between application releases and database releases. But what we're seeing when we speak to customers is we have a lot of development teams that some of them aren't even using version control, you know, never mind doing automated testing and QA. So that presents a big challenge too. And then finally, regulatory compliance, again, that Craig mentioned. A lot of this survey is interesting one actually, because it shows that a lot of vulnerabilities are actually coming from insider attacks. 53% of people in the survey confirmed insider attacks in the last 12 months. And that's happening because there are insecurities in the databases that the DBAs are managing, particularly on the non-production side of things. So production's as tight as anything, but a lot of vulnerabilities actually and insider attacks, you know, accidentally attacks are becoming due to non-production systems and users having access rights that they really shouldn't have. They're too high. So there really is reappraisal of, you know, what access rights people have. And it's difficult, right? Because there are a lot of databases across the environment, both on-prem and in the cloud, and trying to just simply do an inventory of what you've got presents a real challenge, because unless you do that inventory, how are you going to know what you need to protect? So let's get into a couple solutions and quests that we have to address some of these challenges. The first one is to do with data diversity. So in a diverse database world where you've got hybrid environments using a mixture of different platform types, which as that sort of survey said, is becoming more and more reality, what you need is a single pane of glass. What I mean by that is a monitoring tool that is consistent in the way that it looks across the enterprise at all the different database platforms there, whether they are commercial RDMMS, open source relational, or NoSQL. So you see on these tiles at the top here, things like MongoDB, Cassandra, MySQL, Azure SQL DB, Oracle. So you need a single pane of glass, you need a top level view that's showing you where the criticalities are in the environment. So this is looking across the entire environment through one tool, identifying where the critical areas are. As you can see, I've got lots of red, so I've got a lot of work ahead of me, whereas the green areas aren't so bad. And then what I need is the ability then, having got this high level view, of drilling down deep onto any of those different databases to really understand what's going on. So showing what the workload profile looks like, what the storage is, what the database utilization is. And then if I see something that's causing a problem, then I can drill down deeper using multi-dimensional analysis to actually pinpoint the root cause. So in this screenshot, you look on the left of what's called a performance tree. It's showing you different dimensional views of all of that diagnostic data, so the DBA can quickly pinpoint right down to SQL execution level the root cause of the problem. And this, remember, is consistent across all those different platform types, right? So if you've got DBAs that don't necessarily have the skills on a company you've acquired recently that's using MongoDB, that's a challenge, right? They're on the learning curve. So if you've got a platform that enables you to have oversight across all these different platforms and drill down and solve these problems, then that's going to make the DBA's world even easier. This is just showing you the coverage that we have with Foglight for databases across the traditional relational, NoSQL cloud, and open source relational databases as well. Okay, let's move on. So this is a customer success story, and I'll build out all the slide here. So on the left-hand side, you see the challenges that this company had. So this was actually a healthcare company in the US that was managing over 3,000 databases, supporting 1,800 clinical departments. They had a monitoring tool, but it only supported SQL Server. But now they were using MySQL, IBM DB2, and Oracle. So they didn't have the coverage that they needed, and that was leading to significant problems. And so by investing in Foglight for databases, they're able to have a single dashboard to get the necessary diagnostic, analytics, and resolution capabilities, which provided them with the coverage and the diagnostics they needed to reduce the risk of outages. Let's talk about cloud database management and cloud database migration. So migrating to the cloud itself presents a challenge, right? So we have some capabilities in Quest to get you to the cloud, and that's available through SharePlex. So SharePlex is a replication tool that's been with Quest for many, many years, and it's changed the way that it provides different use cases, and the more recent popular use case actually is migration to the cloud. So with SharePlex, you can migrate Oracle databases to any number of different cloud providers for any different environment. So, you know, anything between dev to production, basically. What this diagram shows is SharePlex as being the core tool for doing the migration. It does that migration in such a way that it gives you next to zero downtime and no data loss whatsoever. The key thing with SharePlex is it provides you active-active replication. What I mean by that, it's not a lift and shift. You can do lift and shift if you want to, but if you've got live systems that need to be migrated with no loss of business, then SharePlex is the way to do it, because the way that it works gives you next to zero latency in terms of continuity of business. So it's a great thing to use for HADR, for example, or for load balancing. You can do a whole number of other things with SharePlex. With Oracle, so you can move across different versions of Oracle, you can move across different editions of Oracle and different operating systems. Backing SharePlex up, you've got Foglight, which can be used as well to track performance differences between on-prem and the cloud. You've got Benchmark Factory, which is a load testing tool which can be used to help right-size the correct service tier. So you can use this for scalability testing both on-prem and the cloud, compare performance. And you've also got Toad for Oracle, which can provide everyday database administration, automation, as well as sensitive data protection. I'll talk about that in a bit. Another customer success story. This is an online travel company, and this was their entire business, actually. Their entire business was this online travel booking website. They had a single point of failure because their data center was just an on-prem data center, so they're very exposed. They had poor customer experience and were concerned about loss of business because they didn't really have any operational control. And so they used SharePlex to set up a cloud mirror of their on-prem data center with active-active bidirectional replication. So it was a true mirror of their on-prem data center. But the other thing is they were able to control transactional throughput between the on-prem and the cloud, so they could have this operational control they needed as demand changed. Let's talk about DevOps and CICD. So this is another graphic which shows what we have that supports CI/CD for database, specifically Oracle and SQL Server. So over on the left, in fact, this shows the whole kind of end-to-end CI/CD delivery pipeline, if you will. So we have developers over on the left, so they can use Toad for Oracle, or they can use Apex SQL for SQL Server. Both these tools integrate with source control. So as they make their code changes and other things like code quality and unit testing, they can check all those things into source control, and that will then kick off the build process. Okay, so during the build automation process, the idea of these two other tools you see in the middle, Toad DevOps Toolkit for Oracle, Apex SQL DevOps Toolkit for SQL, is it works within the build process and integrates all the things that were delivered to the source control system as part of the overall build process. And it works with Bamboo, Jenkins, Visual Studio, and a bunch of other ones, but it allows you to integrate database changes for Oracle and SQL Server with your application changes and deliver them downstream. Now, before we get too excited about delivering straight into production, one of the other key things as well is that you've got to take account of workload changes, right? So if you have any worries, the DBA has some worries about delivering all this change straight into production environment, there's another thing you can use as well. I mentioned before, Benchmark Factory, which is a load testing tool, is you can call Benchmark Factory testing through a REST API. Now that's really cool because you can automate it. So you can have this load testing job called on the fly to load test all the changes that you've got before you get to production, and then use Foglight, which has a piece called change tracking, to track any changes in performance profile in the delivery changes that you have before you get to production. So it gives you some reassurance, or I guess, before you get to production, that those production changes are not going to cause issues, right? You're mitigating any risks of slowdowns and things like that. So then you're ready to release into production. So we have compare and sync capabilities, both at the structural level and the data level, which generates 100% accurate deployment scripts. So you can release those changes in production. And if you're using Oracle, then you've also got the benefit of replicating those changes into another environment, such as a cloud database. So you've got a continuously moving set of changes all the way from your on-prem into the cloud. In fact, even if you could even do on the SQL Server, you could actually integrate that directly with Azure DevOps Services. Another customer success story here, financial services company. They were, like a lot of companies really, the database releases were just way too slow. They were actually every 8 weeks. It was a significant bottleneck for their business. Their business needed increasing operational efficiency. They invested in Toad DevOps Toolkit on the Oracle side to increase the automation on the code testing and quality to reduce defects. And now they're able to release database changes every 2 weeks. That's a 4x improvement. And then finally, security compliance. So there's a couple of solutions actually. So if we look at one is for SQL Server, one is for Oracle. So, and the key thing here is discovery before you protect. So you need to be able to discover where your sensitive and personal data is in your environment. I think Craig touched on that earlier on, before you can do anything with it, whether you protect it, mask it, redact it, set up audit controls. You have to know where it is, right? So both our SQL Server tool, Apex SQL Mask, and our Oracle tool, which is Toad for Oracle with a sensitive data protection module, they're both very similar insofar as they will go out across all of your different databases, and based on a set of prescribed rules that you define as a DBA, will search for data that is sensitive or personal, so you can then decide on what you want to do, whether you want to mask it if it's not production, encrypt it if it's in production, redact it if it's in production or non-production, and then set up audit policies to make sure that you're secure and you're not going to have any security exposures. And then just one final slide. We had a company who had just this issue. So this was a company that, a clinical research company actually, they had a lot of databases spread over their environment. They had no clue as to what data was sensitive or personal. And you appreciate this is a clinical research company, right? So this is patient records. And so they invested in the Apex SQL audit solution, and they were able to, in fact, Apex SQL audit and Apex SQL mask, to identify and classify sensitive and personal data, set up auditing policies, and now they feel much more confident that they're protected against any potential non-compliance or breaches. So I think that is it. I just want to finish with this closing slide, just as a recap. So this is where we kind of sit from our solutions perspective for each of these key areas. Some of them are common, of course, like Toad, but Foglight is certainly for a diverse database enterprise is a well-recommended tool of choice. That is it from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, John. So we do have one question pending here, but if others of you have questions, do feel free to ask them in the question box here. This is kind of a general question for both of you. How do we bring agility into changing data structures without impacting operations? This is kind of a big topic. Craig, any ideas?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's probably the most significant thing that DBAs worry about when you are moving into a DevOps world. One thing going wrong in a database structure can cause an untold amount of heartache for the DBA, can result in outages and so on. So I think the only way you're going to be able to become more agile and to be able to adopt this is with tooling. Some of the things that John talked about. Lots of vendors out there who offer additional tooling that will allow the structures to be changed, not using, just pure DDL, but examine what you need to do, figure out from an analytical perspective everything that can impact, then generate a script that makes that change. So it's more of an overall holistic approach to how you're doing it, instead of, oh, I can do create and drop statements. Well, sure, anyone can do create and drop statements, but doing them right, that's another thing altogether. And knowing, as a DBA does, that if I drop this, it also drops that, and takes away the security and gets, you have to rebuild all of that stuff up. And if you just leave that in the developer's hands, that's not going to be done correctly. And it's not because developers are stupid, or what sometimes people try to say. It's that they have a completely different job. It's build this application. The DBA has another job. It's make sure the database is sound. And the two of them need to work in concert together. And it needs this entire pipeline of tools, like I hinted at, like John talked about, that you're not going to do it without that. So just saying we've adopted DevOps, so things are going to move more quickly. No, you adopt DevOps, you adopt the tooling, you adopt the cultural mindset, and you do it on the dev side. You got to do it on the ops side. And all too often it's, we've adopted DevOps, but you've adopted dev, not ops. It's all dev. So it's got to be both.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Where we see companies go wrong with this is they don't have direction and leadership from their executive leadership team. They try and do it on their own. It's never going to work. You've got to have, and you touched on this, Craig. It's a cultural change. Tools are not the magic bullet. They will help. They will help automate some of the processes that are currently manual on the database side. Still give you that checks and balances, but ultimately the DBA still pushes the button. I don't believe anytime soon we're going to see a completely end-to-end automated process where the DBA is not even part of that equation. That's not going to happen. So the DBA still has control, but they have to collaborate with everybody else, because DBAs typically don't get involved in the database coding side of things, and therefore they don't understand what it is they're applying. And that's a major bottleneck right there, because the DBA looks at that DDL code and thinks, I have no clue what this is going to do. I just hope it's not going to break anything. So collaboration is key. And you hit the nail on the head there, Craig, when you said that it's a change in the way that you work. It's not just about tools, it's a whole different way of working.
That sort of implies management support at a
Absolutely.
higher level to coordinate all this.
Yep.
Yeah.
And how often do you find that is present?
Well, that use case I gave you, actually, they did. So that whole project was directed by their CTO office. So their CTO office was in operational control, and they brought in the stakeholders. But I've seen other cases where you've got a project team spun up, says, we got to do DevOps, right? And they're just left to their own devices, and that just doesn't work.
No. Craig, you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I just say where you see it is the ones that succeed. You know, if they're being successful with it, they have management buy-in, they've had a cultural shift and a mindset shift. If you're not succeeding, you haven't done it.
Well put.
Yeah.
You know, Craig, when you were talking about staffing and the numbers are going in the wrong direction there for the percentages of staffing. And I'm wondering, how do people who are basically not management level to hire staff and get budget, how do they convince their managements that that's a necessity?
Boy,
I know,
if I knew that, I'd be a lot richer than I am, because I wouldn't tell anybody, and I'd write a book about it or have a consulting practice on it. But I would say that a trick that you might try is to figure out what's important to the organization. What are your executives saying? And then find out how you get your goals built into that budget.
Okay.
So, like if, a couple of years ago when big data was all the rage, I was saying, if it's data, make it big data, because that will get you the budget.
That's the buzzword.
Right. So find a way to align with that. Just because you're a DBA, you're not doing big data analytics, but you are managing the data that is part of the big data analytics. That has to become part of the budget. So what's the trend? Slide your needs into that, whatever and wherever that is. If it's cloud, we're putting data in the cloud. Let's get some tools to make sure we get data put in the cloud correctly and managed correctly, and so on.
Somebody said to me, actually, on a customer event recently, that the new buzzword to get your budget is security. So security gets a lot of budget. So if you can attach your project to anything security related, then you're going to get some budget.
All right.
Good one.
Good advice from you two, both of you. Well, thank you both very, very much. Appreciate all the insights and all the information. And I'd like to also thank our diamond sponsor, Sumo Logic. And stay tuned here. We will be starting the next session of Data Summit Connect in about an hour. So we shall see you all then. Thanks again to John and to Craig.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.